Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 67. The mission of our Digging Deeper moments is to take God's Word to God's world. We are so glad that you joined us. Over the past few weeks, we've been discussing conflict resolution from a biblical perspective. Today, I want to share a few thoughts with you about how we view conflict that in hindsight, I would have shared with you at the beginning of our series but overlooked. In her book, Church Conflict, Norma Everest writes, "Each of us has our own image of conflict that can be expressed in a word, a phrase, or shown as an object. Is it a mess, an adventure, or a maze? In the face of conflict, do you feel a surge of energy, a knot in the stomach, exhausted? By understanding our images and feelings about conflict, we can better understand our reactions to it. In beginning to identify our different images of conflict, we can begin to see why we handle conflict differently, and we can begin to move from contention to collaboration. What Everest is saying is that there's a direct correlation between how we see conflict and how we address it. We see this in the Bible. Take the Church of Corinth, for example. Their method of conflict resolution was to sue each other. Yeah, Christians suing each other. We pick it up in the first book of Corinthians, chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, where the Apostle Paul writes, "Dare any of you, having a matter against each other, go to the law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world?" Boy, I'd really like to preach on that one. I'm going to come back to that one maybe in our next series. "And if the world will be judged by you, are you not worthy to judge the smallest matters? Do you not know that we shall judge angels? How much more the things that pertain to this life? If then you have judgments concerning things pertaining to this life, do you appoint those who are least esteemed by the church to judge? I say this to your shame. Is it so that there's not a wise man among you, not even one who will be able to judge between his brethren? But brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers." Now the question is, why would they do such a thing? Why were these Christians in Corinth going to court and suing each other when they had a conflict? Well, the answer is simple. Because they're Greeks. And in the image of conflict amongst the Greek culture is that it's a trial. It's a court case. We know that Athens was the source of Greek culture. And in Athens, if you had a conflict, first, you try to resolve it by privately picking a third party who could be a go-between between you. But if that didn't work, the second thing you do is you would take your conflict before the court of 40 who they would pick a public arbitrator who would work this thing out. These arbiters were picked from all the citizens in the city that were 60 years old or older. And if you were picked, you had to serve under the penalty of law. And we complain about jury duty. They had jury duty back then. The third thing that would happen is if it wasn't resolved in this court of 40, it was then referred to a jury, which consisted of 201 to 401 citizens in larger cases. And in some really big cases, there'd be 1,000 to 6,000 people that your case would come before. Now, all these citizens had to be 30 years age or above. Now, the effect is this, that because of their approach to conflict, everyone in Athens spent a significant amount of time in court. You know, we watch TV shows, that do court cases. It was a big deal. It was on TV all the time in Athens. They loved court dramas. Everybody was used to hearing cases. They were used to deciding cases. They were used to being on a jury. So going to court was a major part of their culture. So when they got in conflict, how did they see conflict? They saw their conflict as a trial. And so how did they see themselves? They saw themselves as lawyers. In their minds, they were all Matlock. They were all Perry Mason. They were all Jack McCoy or Alan Shore. They were all the expert lawyers going to win the case. So when a conflict erupted in the church of Corinth, what did they do? They went to court. And so the Apostle Paul writes in verse 6, "Brother goes to law against brother, and that before unbelievers." Now, when the Christians in Corinth sued each other, they were merely acting out their image of conflict, which they had absorbed from their own culture. Could that be true of us today in America? Could it be that when it comes to conflict and conflict resolution, we often act out either how our culture handles it or what we've seen in our home? Could it be that when we fall into a conflict that we're kind of on autopilot and we just kind of do what comes natural to us? Now, one of the ways to determine if you're on autopilot is to ask yourself, what is my image of conflict? Now, most people have not thought about it. I know I didn't until I read Everest's book. I've never really thought about it. But how do you describe, or how do you define, or how do you view conflict? Now, in the past, when people would come to see me that are having conflicts, and they've described conflict to me, their image of conflict, they would say it's like a wall. They would call it a disease, a cancer, or a disaster. But notice how negative their view of conflict is. You know, and if we view conflict negatively, or in a way that seems like it's unsolvable, or it's so big, unscalable, is it any wonder that we would be reluctant to or not so good at resolving it? And so in our closing our series, let me offer you a new image of conflict. This is one I discovered as I studied Scripture over the years. I've been studying the Bible for over 40 years. And I began to notice, as I've studied different books of the Bible, I began to notice that conflict is in almost every book. There's always conflict that has to be resolved. And what I began to notice in the Bible is that once the conflict was properly resolved, it led to good things. That actually conflict wasn't a wall. That in the end, if you resolve conflict through the Bible, you see it over and over and over again, you would come out to the other side with a deeper intimacy, richer friendships, stronger teamwork, a stronger nation, a better community. Whatever the conflict was about, you would end up stronger afterwards. And so I began to see that conflict is not a negative thing, but we perceive it as such. Let me give you one example from the book of Acts. First, we see in Acts chapter 2 that a crowd gathers on the day of Pentecost, and they're very confused, and they actually mock the church. I'd call that a conflict. When people mock me, I call that a conflict. When people mock you, that's a conflict. In Acts chapter 4, Peter is arrested and he's brought before the Sanhedrin, which is the supreme court of the day. That's a conflict. In chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira lied to Peter and the church leaders about how much money they gave in the offering. Conflict. In Acts chapter 6, Greek Christians complain about the Hebrew Christians. Conflict. In Acts 15, legalistic Christians want to correct non-legalistic Christians. Conflict. There is conflict everywhere in the Bible. But first comes the conflict, and after that you find a resolution. The leaders of the nation, or the leaders of the church, or the leaders wherever you're talking in the Bible, those involved, they resolve the conflict. You see it in Acts chapter 2. Peter explains things to the confused crowd, resolution. 3,000 people, well, I'm ahead of myself. Resolution. Acts chapter 4, Peter preaches to the Sanhedrin, resolution. Acts chapter 5, Peter confronts Ananias and Sapphira, resolution. Acts chapter 6, it wasn't the resolution they wanted, but it was resolved. Acts chapter 6, Peter and the 12 solved the problem between the Greeks and the Hebrews, resolution. In Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council settles the dispute that's going on in the church, resolution. So what we see in Acts is that each time conflict raises its ugly head, it's resolved properly by the leadership of the church, and it leads to good things, which in the book of Acts, in this example, it always leads to church growth. Conflict does not stop the church in its mission, it actually catapults it forward. In Acts chapter 2, the church grows to 3,000. In Acts chapter 3, the church grows to 5,000. In Acts chapter 6, the church becomes a multitude. In Acts chapter 16, Paul and Barnabas launch out on their second missionary journey. And so I know I went through that quick, but the point is not for you to get all the details. The point is for you to hear what we're saying tonight. Conflict is not a wall, it's not a cancer, it's not a disease. In fact, we started this series by saying how common it is to all of us. It's everywhere. What isn't so common is conflict resolution. But when we learn to resolve conflict well, conflict is not a wall, a disease, or a cancer. It's actually a door. Between us and greater opportunity and richer community and a better nation and a better world and a better life is conflict. Folks, I can promise you that no matter what you try to achieve in life, whether it's relationships or career or family or friends, you name it, there's going to be conflict. There's going to be things that oppose you. There's going to be things that get in the way. This is why learning to resolve conflict is so important. Because learning how to resolve conflict biblically is really learning how to open doors to greater opportunities, deeper friendships, richer community, and greater opportunities in your life. So, ask yourself, how do I see conflict? Is it time for me to see it differently? Maybe it is. Maybe it's time for us to begin to see conflict not as a wall, but as a door. Next week, we'll begin looking at the background of the Old Testament, and we'll see how it unlocks the meaning of a number of Old Testament stories. I'm really excited about this series, and I hope you'll join us. If today's lesson helped you, please share it with a friend. And if you want to access all of Eagle's Nest resources, check out our online campus through one of our social media platforms, which are listed for you on the screen. I hope to see you next week. God bless.